With the help of Hashem, we are learning Beitzah, Daf, Yud, Dalid. We left off on top of the Amid by the Mishnah. This is going to be a Daf, Mamish, about Melachis as they pertain to Yamtiv. We're going to begin learning laws regarding pounding, crushing, being toichen, spices, grounding, pounding, salt. Bechlal, Shitas Rashi is that any malacha, even food related, that could have been done before Yamtiv with mamish equal results, it would have been just as fresh, it would have been just as good, may not be done on Yamtiv. We'll see how this relates to the question of pounding or grinding spices, salt in a mortar and a pestle. And as we will see, in certain scenarios, making a shinui will be enough to make it permissible on Yamtiv. We will actually learn the concept, the halachic concept of a regular deviation, a regular shinui, versus what we call a shinui zuta, a minor deviation. Sometimes all you need is a minor deviation, and we'll see the difference between spices versus salt. Now, on Amid Beis, we're going to learn about boirer on Yamtiv, the general rule concerning boirer, separating. What type of boirer is allowed on Shabbos? Ayol is dinamanic. It has to be oichel mitoich hapsoilis, the good, what's good for you, from the impurities, from what's not good for you. It has to be done yad. In other words, you may not use an instrument to affect the boirer, even oichel mitoich hapsoilis, and it only may be done la'alter, which means right prior to eating. Question is, do you need this concept of ayol regarding Yamtiv, or do we say by Yamtiv, since it's food related, we're speaking about boirer food related, there is absolutely no issue with boirer. I want to just make clear that there is boirer non-food related as well. That's not the topic of our sugya. We're going to also learn b'derech hagav that whenever there's a mixture of food and there is more psoilis than oichel, being that the psoilis is actually muktzah, right, because it's not muchen for anything, and there's a concept of bittul baroiv, everything becomes muktzah. Everything becomes muktzah, and this is true even on Yamtiv. And the final topic on Daf Yud Daled Amid Beis will be regarding sending presents, gifts to friends on Yamtiv. We're going to learn how this might affect limitations on food-related gifts, how this will limit non-food related gifts, and there'll be the general rule that kol shenei oisem boi, any gift, food or not, that the recipient will benefit from, will have hana'ah from on Yamtiv, may be sent on Yamtiv. And something that may not be used on Yamtiv, as we will see, also may not be gifted on Yamtiv. Including in this topic will be someone who's gifting his fellow a material that's kalayim. And we're going to therefore, because of the topic of kalayim, we're going to learn bottom line that any material that is so hard that it doesn't provide warmth will be a material that you will be allowed to sit upon. You will be allowed to place a bag on your lap. We're not speaking about getting dressed in it, because even though the Isser of Kalayim isn't only on a beged that you dress into, but a beged that provides you warmth, if it's not going to provide warmth, and the connection of warmth is connected with softness, the harder, the less warmth it provides. Ultimately, really hard materials provide absolutely no warmth. Just for the intro, just an example. Today our shoes are so advanced compared to the shoes they had then. So the undershoe, the soles, that which is put, what we would call the sole of the shoe, can be made out of kalayim, because it's made to be a sole, and therefore it's so hard, and because of the hardness it doesn't provide warmth, and it doesn't bother us, even if it's made out of wool and linen together, and many, many other halachas. Let's start on Daf Yud Daled Amud Aleph by the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Beishamai Oimrim, Tavlin, spices. Spices, according to Beishamai, may not be crushed in a regular way on Yamtiv. You have to make, and here we'll have the term, a shinui cotton, or in Rashi, a shinui zuta, a small deviation. What will be an example of making a small deviation? Nidoichin, you can crush it, but the madoich shaleitz, what you need to use is a wooden pestle. In other words, the mortar the keli could be stone, which was the regular mortar. Normally the pestle, the stick that you used to crush, was also made out of stone. If all you do is deviate that the pestle, instead of a stone, you make it out of wood, again, the words of Rashi is that's called a shinui zuta, genuk, you're allowed to do it. And in contrast, when it comes to crushing salt, now it's important, a detail, that we're speaking not salt that became hard in your kitchen, but salt that was extracted in one goylem, in one clump, and you are now crushing it for the first time. Crushing, pounding, grinding salt, right? This is just to know, the name of the av is tchina, toichen, is more problematic. Even leBeit Shammai, you could do it, but here you have to make a bigger shinui, a real shinui, a deviation. Not enough for you only to use a pestle made out of wood. So what's the greater shinui? Either befach. Befach means that the mortar itself, the keli, is an earthenware keli. Normally when people would pound or grind, they would use dafka stone. So the keli is being changed. Or, if you want to still use the normal stone mortar, it's not enough for you to use a wooden pestle, but here you have to use ube'etz haparur. Here you have to use a wooden mixing spoon, which is something very unusual, or at least more unusual than the madoich shel eitz. Beis Hillel is lenient, always one notch more lenient than Beis Shammai. So when it comes to tavlin, regular spices, according to Beis Hillel, nidoichem kedarkon, you can crush them in the usual manner. In other words, not only is the mortar, you can use a stone mortar, you can use a stone pestle, not even a shinui zuta is needed. However, Beis Hillel in our version is moided to Beis Shammai that salt is more problematic, but according to Beis Hillel, the solution of being allowed to, the way that one is allowed to grind or to crush, to break down salt on Yamtiv, is they're making a shinui zuta, which is using madoich shel eitz, only the minor deviation, using the pestle should be made out of wood, and that's enough to make the shinui. Okay, so what's the bottom line? That bein leBeit Shammai, bein leBeis Hillel, salt is problematic. The kula alma mia melach boy shinui. Why my tama? Why? What's the problem? In other words, what's the question? I know that toichen, right, grinding is an av, but this is food related. You're pounding, you're crushing spices. You're pounding and crushing salt. What's the problem? Rav Huna and Rav Chizda argue what the reason is. Chadamar, and we're explaining also with that why is salt more lenient, why is salt more stringent than spices. That kol hakadeiros kulam tzrichos melech, all cooked dishes need salt. Not all dishes need to have spices. In other words, according to one of these two opinions, that since you knew before Yamtiv that you will need salt, you should have done it before Yamtiv. So it's like you're exerting yourself needlessly. Now, on Yamtiv, if you didn't get ready, now it's not needless. Say that you make a shinui. Tavlin, leBeis Hillel, b'chlal doesn't even need a shinoi, because who said before Yamtiv that you would need tavlin? Not everything needs to have spices. V'chadamar, another approach, and we paskin like the second approach, kol hatavlin mafigin taimon, all spices, really there's one exception, as we'll see in a moment, they begin to lose their flavor. The flavor begins to go away after you crush it. In other words, it's better if you do it on Yamtiv. And indeed, that's why leBeis Hillel, you can do it without any deviation. Umelach, in contrast, salt, no flavor is lost if you would have crushed it before Yamtiv. And that's the nekuda, that anything that is equally as good, if you would have done it before, is more problematic. Now, sometimes it's completely problematic. Here, at the end of the day, you're making food, Seder, a shinoi, at least a minor one, leBeis Hillel has to be made. Says the Gemara, my beinayu, is there a practical difference between these two reasons? The Gemara says yes, and two reasons on both sides. Ikad beinayu, number one, if the yada my kedera boilav hashulay, if you knew before Yamtiv that you will be making a dish that does need spices, so even leBeis Hillel, since you knew, and the whole reason is, did you know, did you not know, then you would also have to make a deviation. let's just focus on Beis Hillel. Or on the other side, inami bim moirika. Moirika, maybe Kevin will find up a picture, some sort of saffron. It's a spice that is so strong that it does not lose its flavor even after it being pounded or ground. And if the whole reason, Beis Hillel, why you don't even need to make a shinui on spices is because it's fresher if you do it on Yamtiv, not with this moirika spice. Now our Mishnah's version is salt, l'kula alma, needs a deviation. Only question is, Beis Shammai says you have to make a regular, bigger deviation. Beis Hillel says a minor deviation. However, comes along Rav Yehuda and he quotes his teacher Shmuel, and he gave the following psak: Kol hanidoichin, anything that's crushed, nidoichin kedarkon, may be crushed without any deviation. Not only spices, which is the girsa of our Mishnah, but afilu melach. And we're not even talking about our salt again that was crushed. Maybe it got hardened. Crushing it again is much less problematic. We're speaking even if there is some sort of source of raw salt that was never yet grounded or pounded. It can be done without any shinui. The problem is, how can Shmuel make that psak din? Like, okay, you paskin like Beis Hillel, but v'ha amrat, in our Mishnah we learned that everyone agrees that melach needs some sort of shinui. So answers the Gemara here again, like we had in the previous and prior Mishnayos, that there were other Tanoim of later generations that had a different girsa, what the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is all about. And Shmuel paskin like that version. What's the version? Answers the Gemara, who that goes to Shmuel, the Amar ki haytana, the Tanya Amar Rab Meir, lo'nechloku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, al hanidoichin shenidoichin kedarkon. Everyone agrees, even Beis Shammai, that spices for sure you can grind without any deviation. And more than that, if you are already pounding spices and you also have salt, you put salt in the mortar at the same time. In other words, you are not exerting extra effort because anyways you're knocking, you're pounding. Umelach. Everyone agrees to that. The machlokes is only regarding salt, and look at this version, is leducha. This is to pound salt. Bifnei atzma, Beis Shammai says, melach bepach ube'etz haparur. All right, this is taka like our version. That's a proper deviation, not a minor deviation. And even that can only be done litzli, only if you are using salt to roast and you use much less salt to roast. In other words, only a small amount. You may not, according to Beis Shammai, even with the shinoi, pound salt liquidator. Many understand the reason is because the observer might think that you're doing something for later. There's a marasayin issue, and Beis Hillel min akotz el akotz. Beis Hillel, in other words, according to Rav Meir, Beis Shammai is even more chomer than the Mishnah. And Beis Shammai oimrim b'chol davar. B'chol davar, in any item, in any keli. B'chol davar salkadaitach, in any keli. He didn't mean that. There are certain kelim that are muktzah. And even if there's zero issue, pounding salt on Yamtiv, but for sure may not be used in a muktzah de kekeli. Elaima lichol davar. Lichol davar means even for large quantities. And what's not spoken out here, but Rashi adds, and therefore, just like Beis Hillel allows for you to pound large quantities of salt, you also may do it in a usual manner. In andere Werte, the girsa of Rav Meir is that Beis Hillel has no limitations at all when it comes to pounding not spices, not salt, no issue, any amount, in a regular manner, and that's what Shmuel Paskin's like. Amar le Rav Acha bar Dela, liberate to a son, that ki doichas, when you crush salt, atzli, atzluye, atzli here doesn't mean to daven, it means to tilt it, to lean it. Lean the mortar and then viduch, and then grind it. In other words, just to make it clear, Rav Acha bar Dela must paskin like Shmuel, that by the letter of the law, all right, you may use a normal mortar made out of stone and a pestle made out of stone. By the letter of the law, no shinui is needed. He added, narvas, you be machmer. But he, once he's being machmer, he's not following the limitations of the Mishnah. What he said is to do something that's not even mentioned in the Mishnah. It's that little of a deviation. Tilt the mortar a little bit to the side. make epes hashinui. Oh, Rav Sheshes. Further, Shama, he once heard koil buchna, the sound. Buchna means a stone pestle, a proper pestle. No, it's the stone mortar, a stone pestle. He heard these sounds coming from the kitchen of his house on Shabbos. And don't forget, Rav Sheshes was blind. Blind people develop a tremendously sensitive, good, upgraded sense of hearing. Amar, he said, hi lav migavei de Beitzah. I'm sorry, there was a sound. He says, this is not coming from my kitchen. Why did he say that? Because he, in his kitchen, he did not allow pounding salt. The Dilma Atzluye Atzle, didn't we just learn that even people, who went beyond the letter of the law, they accepted the deviation of tilting the mortar. Maybe they were pounding it in his kitchen and they made that deviation and he would have been okay with that. No, the Shamai Dahavat Solol Kale. It's amazing how good his hearing was. He heard that the sound was very clear. If you tilt the mortar to the side, the sounds become muffled. So from the way it sounded, he knew that it was kept upright. Taka for salt, l'chumra be machmer, but maybe they were pounding tavlin. And even according to our version in the Mishnah, Beisilol by tavlin allows it kedarkoi. So the Gemara answers the Gemara, no. Tavlin abuchim and abach kolayu, that spices, they make a much louder sound. No, it's from the sound, he knew it's salt. From the sound, he knew that they did not tilt the mortar. And he was confident that in my kitchen, it's not being done. Okay, so our Mishnah was speaking about pounding spices. Our Mishnah was speaking about pounding salt. Now let's move on to pounding grain, which is more problematic. Because in most cases, like we learned, people would grind, right, the grain, they would pound it, making it into flour. All of this may not be done on Yamtiv. It's only from kneading milisha ve'elach that you are allowed to do. On the other hand, what we call today hot cereal, people have they have these crushed or pounded different grains, and then they add water on it and they eat it. Right? It was called chilka, it's called daisa, it's called tisni. There were different types of. It's called oatmeal. Now tisni is a type of oatmeal, what I call oatmeal. It's a hot cereal that you take grains and you pound each kernel into 4 little parts. That's a higher level of pounding. There were other types of hot cereals, of oatmeals, that was called chilka or disa, that had less breakage. It was pound less. So says the Gemara, Rabbanan, Ein oisen tisni. You may not make tisni on Yamtiv. Look inside Rashi, the second line under the Gemara. Why not? Because shetoirach gadolu. Why is it called a greater toirach than chilka and disa? Because shekoitish hachitim ad shenechlakim echad la'arba'a, and therefore you may not do it. And as we'll see, and so it will remain in the maskana, that other types of oatmeals, taking the grains and crushing them into only 2 parts, into lesser parts, and that is called chilka or disa or daisa, that will be permitted. That's how that will be the maskana. Until we get there, we're going to schwitz a little bit. But the Beitzah begins: you may not make tisni, and and the second statement in the Beitzah is ve'ein koichin b'machteshes. You may not grind wheat. You may not grind kernels, any kernels of any types of grains, in a mortar. Period. Now that's a problem. That's a contradiction. Because the second statement that ein koichin b'machteshes, like Rashi says, is mashma that even a grain that you're not pounding into tisni, even if you're making something only into chilka or disa or daisa, which is much less of a work, is also not allowed. But the first clause only is specifying that tisni may not be made, mashma, that grains that need less pounding will be allowed. So which one is it? So answers the Gemara, and here we develop the answer. Hakika Amar, my tam, why the Beitzah explains itself. Why may you not make tisni? Lefi she'ein koichin b'machteshes. But the problem is that if ein koichne b'machteshes, and that, by the way, will include an isur even on chilka or disa, so let the Beitzah only say ein koichne b'machteshes, and it's going to be self-understood. There's no way you can make tisni if you're not using a mortar. So answers the Gemara, itani ein koichne b'machteshes, you cannot crush in a mortar, period, any grains. Havamina, maybe you would think the Beitzah is only referring to a large b'machteshes gedoyla, which is what's normally used for tisni. Avol b'machteshes katana, the smaller the mortar, the harder it is to crush. That which demands more crushing is normally done in a larger keli. Using a small keli for tisni is a shinoi, and therefore you might have thought that will be okay, right? That's why the Beitzah made two clauses, as we're learning so far, to make it, you can't use a mortar. And even if you're going to make tisni in a small one, it also may not be done. Okay, so clearly the way we're learning is that b'machteshes katana, not even a machteshes katana can be used. V'hatanya will call this Beitzah number 2, ein koichin only b'machteshes gedoyla, avol koichin b'machteshes katana. No, this whole sugi is that pounding on Yamtiv will be allowed sometimes b'shinoi, and with the shinoi it's allowed, shinoi meaning using a small mortar. So Amar Abaya, Kitanya nami b'masnisa, when the first Beitzah taught you may not crush in a mortar, now we're clarifying. It means only in a large mortar. In other words, chilka and disa may not be crushed in a large mortar. Chilka and disa may be crushed in a small mortar. And then tisni, because it demands more work, that not even in a small mortar. Gavaldik. So there's two things here. First of all, you have to make a shinui, and that means grains, all types of oatmeals were crushed in a large one. Never use a large one. Can you use a small one? Tisni not, because it demands too much exertion, too much work, and that may not be done on Yamtiv. Daf Yudalot on the base. Rava gives another approach. Rava says that when it says in the first Beitzah, and we learned it correct, that you may not crush grain even in a small mortar, that's the stira. The second Beitzah says that a small mortar is allowed, like kasha. Halon, the second Beitzah that permits, lon means us and bavel. The second Beitzah that permits using a small machteshes to crush grains that you will just add water to and eat. That's in bavel, because really this type of shinoi is enough by the letter of the law. It's allowed. In Eretz Yisrael, there's a problem. What's the problem in Eretz Yisrael? That there they were wealthier at this time when these Beitzahs were taught. Many people had avodim. The avodim couldn't care what they are using, and the owners would tell them, "Hey, how did you make this?" They would lie and say, "We made it in a machteshes ketana," but they would end up using a machteshes gedoyla, and there was chilul yamtiv going on. So the Chazal felt, you know what we got to do? Outlawed. You can't even use a minor mortar. And similarly, based on this concept of Papi, he visited once the house of the master Shmuel, and they brought for him daisa. And as we just learned, that daisa in a small mortar is allowed to be made on Yom Tov, means you can crush the kernels, but he didn't eat it. Why? And we just learned that chilka and disa or daisa are allowed to be made as long as you make a shino, use a small mortar. Answers the Gemara, no. That since he saw the hava dayik tvei, that it was very fine, and like we mentioned, the larger the mortar, the easier it is to crush it, and the better effect the crushing has. And from the way it was so fine, he knew they used a big mortar. And that was taka the whole chashash. Now guys, this happened in the house of Shmuel. No, Shmuel gave the rules. They knew that they may not use a large mortar. They did it with a large mortar, and they said we used the machteshes ketana. Maybe they did it before Yamtiv, which is for sure not a problem. So here again, the Chazye of Papi saw the Havi Kolif Tzohari, that the color, that the appearance was streaked, or the appearance was very light, it was bright. He knew that this must have been done right now on Yamtiv. Since the household of Shmuel was very wealthy, and therefore there were many avadim. The Ika Pritzusa da Avdei, So it's like a common sense that if you go into someone's home and today on Shabbos and on Yamtiv, and there are many non-Jews in the kitchen, you got to be extra concerned that even the balabas, the balabasta, they know Hilchos Shabbos, they know the rules, what could, what cannot be done, but they always have to take into account the practical possibility that the kitchen help, they did whatever they wanted to do, and they knew that they'll get away with it because they're going to say, we did it in a kosher way. And if you have such a chasash, then some things that theoretically are good should not be consumed, in our case, on Yamtiv. Okay, it's late, let's move to the next sugya. So we went from Toichin, now we're going to Boider. Boider and Shabbos, like we said in the introduction, 3 conditions must be met for you to be allowed when it comes to food separation, for you to be allowed to do it on Shabbos. Oichel mitoich hapsoilus, and not the other way around. Yad and not keli, and la'alter and not for later. Says the Mishnah, what do we say regarding Yamtiv? Haboider kitnius b'Yamtiv. This is a classical case because legumes normally after you would gather it in your home, beans, let's say, the bowl would still be filled with many impurities. Normally you would wash it. There were different systems for every type of legume that you would use to get rid of the impurities. Some of it was earth, some of it was straw. Can you do it on Yamtiv? Beishamai oimrim, that you can only do it on Yamtiv the way you do it on Shabbos, which is boirer oichel. You remove the good from the impure. You remove that which you will eat from that which you will not eat. And I know that Beishamai didn't speak about the Yad and La'alter, but that's Pshat and Beishamai. He speaks about the first rule. What he means is that Yamtiv is equal to Shabbos as far as Boirer is concerned. Beis Hillel Oimrim, he rejects Beishamai, and again we paskin obviously like Beis Hillel, Boirer Kedarkoi. You can remove the psoilus from the oichel. But one second, you don't have to use therefore your hand. According to Beis Hillel, can you use a real, proper, large keli? There is a limitation. There is a limitation. So, first of all, one system was bechekoi. They would put on their lap, they would put a tablecloth, they would put a towel, they would put a shemata, and they would put the legumes or other types of kitnias, and then they would manipulate the sheet. And once things begin to roll, so normally the food weighed more. Depends what the psoilus is. The psoilus weighed less, or the opposite, if it was mixed with pebbles. Whenever weighed more would roll to one side, the food would remain on the other side. That is allowed to be done on Yamtiv. Or bekanoin ubetamchay, a funnel or a plate. These are kalim that were not made for boider, but people regularly would use them to do boider. Like the same concept, put things on a plate. If the oichel and the psoilus have different weights, then when you tilt it to the side, whatever weighs more goes to one side, whatever weighs less goes to the other side. I don't care which from which. It can be oichel metoich psoilus, avada, it can be psoilus metoich oichel, and you can do it. But even according to Beis Hillel, there's one limitation. A very large board, or a keli that's made for boider, which is a fine sieve, a more coarse sieve. These are items that may not be done l'Beis Hillel. There's a big discussion amongst the Rishonim. What is the issue? Let's follow that according to Beis Hillel, midoraisa, there's no boider at all. Midrabanan, there are restrictions because they did not want for you to do things on Yamtiv for the weekday. Now that's like a problematic midoraisa. But it gives that appearance. When you start using these large kalim, people don't know how much you need all of that today. As long as you do it in this unprofessional way, you put things on a plate, the people know you're only doing what you need right now. Okay. Rab Gamliel disagrees and is even more lenient than Beis Hillel. You can even make boider on large amounts. There is no limit. And the example that he uses is madiach v'shoila, rinse and skim. And I'll say, the Gemara says like this: they would take beans, just for example. They would take a legume that was filled with straw. Straw weighs less than the beans. So they would fill up the bucket with water. The level of the water would go higher than the food, higher than the legumes, higher than the beans. All of the psoilus, which is lighter, would float to the top. That's just one example. And then he would remove the top of the water. he would skim it off. Now, Beis Hillel, the problem Beis Hillel is not that you are taking the psoilus of the oichel. Beis Hillel also agrees that on Yamtiv, I don't care, you can go psoilus mi ha'oichel, but you can't use a large utensil. It's about the quantity. It's about people thinking that you're doing so much, you don't need all this for today. Rabban Gamliel had no such concern. He was the most lenient. Says the Gemara, Tanya, Amar Rabban Gamliel, that the medvarim amurim, that you can remove the psoilus from the oichel. And by the way, this isn't only Rabban Gamliel, but this is also Beis Hillel. Right? It's not oichel mitoich psoilus. It's also psoilus mitoich oichel. That's only kishu oichel merumal psoilus, where there's more food than impurities, and therefore what? You are exerting less effort. It's about how much effort. Tircha shaloi l'tzoyrech. Exerting unnecessary effort, b'chlal is not allowed on Yamtiv. Abel, if there are more impurities than food, it's more work to get the impurities off than divrei hakol, noiklas oichel, or maneachas apseilas, not because of the boiler issue, but because of tircha, shaloi l'tzoyrech. Frag the Gemara upa, now this is a big chiddush here. If there is more impurities than food, as we spoke out in the introduction, then everything becomes automatically muktzah. Because psoilas, per se, anything that cannot be used on Yamtiv is muktzah. And if the oichel is in the minority, it's batal beroiv. Wow. And therefore everything has a status of muktzah. Mi command the shari. Forget about boider. So the Gemara clarifies what Rabban Gamliel meant was, the nafish betircha must be that in quantity there's less psoilus than oichel, which is why there's no muktzah issue. But you know what? Every type of legume, every type of food, there are different techniques how you do the act of separation. Sometimes it takes more effort to take out the psoilus. Sometimes it takes more effort to take out the oichel. So the point that Rabban Gamliel is saying, not only l'shitasai, but also l'shitas Beis Hillel, boirer doesn't demand oichel metoich psoilus. Yamtiv psoilus metoich oichel. But if v'zutar nafish betircha, if getting rid of the psoilus will demand more work, even if quantitatively it's less, which is why it's not muktzah. Don't exert yourself needlessly. Weiter Rabban Gamliel oimer that af madiach v'shoila, this technique that is done normally even for larger quantities, which is rinsing, as we explained, putting it in a bucket. And after the water goes above the height of the food that's in there, the water will have in it. Now, by the way, it's not so simple. What goes to the top? Every product is different. But even in a case where the psoilus goes to the top, you can skim off the psoilus. So it's sai, not like Beis Shammai. And more than that, there's no limit. You can do large amounts. Tanya Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok that kach hoya min hagen shel beis Rabban Gamliel. Indeed, and that explains the madiach, because the word madiach sounds like you're rinsing it. But this was what they did. Shoymevian deli. They would take a bucket, and the bucket, for example, they filled it with adashim, with lentils, a type of kitnias. Umatzifin olav mayim, and water would be added to the bucket until water is above, floating above the adashim. And what happens? V'nimtza oichel lamata. In the case that we're speaking here in the Beitzah, the case of Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok, the food was in the bottom. The psoilus, which was lighter, went to the top. And then, easy, with the least amount of tircha, you simply skim off the top of the water, and out goes all the psoilus. The problem is that in another Beitzah we learned, as the Beitzah explains the meaning of madiach v'shoila, same thing, it doesn't mean to rinse it with a hose. It means they put it in a large bucket. But there, the metzias was that the food went to the top and the psoilus went to the bottom. So which one was it? Both are true. Answers the Gemara like Kasha. If the impurities are afra, earth, pebbles, or pebbles, they weigh more than lentils. If that's the impurity, that goes to the bottom. So what would they do? They would skim off the oichel. If the kitnias is mixed with gilei, with straw is lighter than the oichel. So then the tzilei would go to the top. Point is, it makes no difference. Not only are we not concerned with what from what, oichel metoich psoilus metoich oichel is equally okay, we also don't care even if you are using a large keli, Libei Hillel, it gives the appearance that you're doing something for the weekday, and Rabbi Gamliel does not allow you to do anything for the weekday, but he doesn't care about the Maras Ayin over here. Whatever you need to do for Yamtiv, do it in the easiest manner possible, using the proper utensils, and v'hakol muter v'sharer v'kayim. All right, final topic of today, which will continue into tomorrow, and that is sending gifts on Yamtiv. And the Nakuda here will be, if the gift could be used on Yamtiv, we'll see Libei Hillel, you are okay. And Beis Shammai says, Ein mishalchen be Yamtiv, you may not send on Yamtiv, ela manois. The word manois, Rashi says, means cut pieces of food. What you are gifting is clear to all that it will be consumed today. Beis Hillel oimrim, knows it has to be eaten today. A cut piece of meat, yeah. You're going to send a whole zeitel of an animal. People know you're not, even though you're going to eat some of it today, but it's not only for today. Beis Hillel doesn't have such a limit. Mishalchin, you can send a whole behema, a ganze chaya, a bird, and don't think that it has to be slaughtered. It can even be alive, and it can be shchutin. Likewise, mishalchen, you can send as a gift on Yamtiv, yeinois, wines, shmanim, oils, salasois, flour, the kitnias and legumes. But even according to Beis Hillel, there is one limitation, and that is aval loy tvua. Why not? As we just learned above, spices and salt have much less limitations in how you may grind them. Fakert, what we learned is grains is a lot more problematic. Normally, grains were properly made into flour, which may not be done on Yamtiv. So even Beis Hillel is maida, don't send tvua, right? Because you can't use it on Yamtiv. And everything that we mentioned, some of it you could. Beis Shammai holds all of it has to be used. Beis Hillel says not all of it. But if some of it is going to be used today, you're good. But not tvua. And Rabbi Shimon says that since some people, again we spoke about the chilka and the disa, there are certain types of kernels of wheat, barley, v'chuli, that they would pound in the small mortar, like we learned. There is a permissible way to do it. Most people would not use it for that. Most people would make it into flour, but you can even send tvua, because there is a way for you to cook it on Yamtiv without breaking any halachas. So as long as there is a possibility, even if the bepoil, the recipient, won't use it today, it doesn't bother me. You gave a gift, something that could be used on Yamtiv. Says the Gemara Tani Rav Yechiel, that even according to Beis Hillel, that you can send large amounts of gifts. Lo yasenu b'shura, don't send it with a large party, like Yaakov sent gifts to Esav. What's the shura? Shura means that there are many times you want to make an impression, the recipient should see that, wow, you're gifting. So instead of sending it in one go, like you have a few people, and you would send wine with the first, and wine with the second, and wine with the third, and the recipient is receiving and receiving and receiving, that is something that you may not do on Yamtiv. 1 second, theoretically, you can all consume it on Yamtiv. So Rashi says that this limitation of Rabbi Yechiel is because, I'm reading inside Rashi, the Avasha Milsa, it will attract attention, and it's going to look like you're selling merchandise. Like so much, even if you're giving it all as a gift. Tana, what's the definition of so much? What's the shura? Literally, shura means a line of people. What's the shura? Tana, we learned, if it's 3 people or more, that's what's not allowed. Doubling the gift is still allowed, even according to this Rav Yechiel. By Rav Ashi, hold on. I understand if you're sending the same item with various people is not allowed. But what happens? What happens if you're sending wine and oil, and meat? And you're sending it, now you could have sent it with one person. To make a bigger impression, you're sending it with 3 people. But every person is carrying something that no one else is carrying. Is that also problematic? Or not? Maybe we say the whole concept of a shura, like Rashi says, it looks like you are going to sell merchandise in the market, is only if you're sending the same item with many people. If it's different items, maybe it's permissible. Says the Gemara, this kasha teku stands. Because like we mentioned, because even though most people take tefua and they make it into flour, which may not be done on Yamtiv, but you can eat it on Yamtiv, like we learned, crushing it with a shinui. Tanya Rab Shimon matir betfua kigoin. He gives examples. If you send wheat, there's a certain dish called ludiyos, and people made it, and there's nothing problematic turning chitim into ludiyos on Yamtiv. So oirim can be given to animals. Adoshim can be made into a dish called resisin. So therefore, even if you know and the recipient knows that probably they're going to end up keeping it for the week, as long as there's one permissible way that it could be done on Yamtiv, you can send it and no limitation on the amount. As long as you don't send the same thing with many people. Now we're going to move from food to non-food items. The same concept. Can you send a non-food gift on Yamtiv? Says the Mishnah, Mishalchin Kalim. You can send, Kalim means garments, or shmata, materials. Being tfurim, whether they're sewn, so it's what we would call a garment. Being she'enu tfurim, it's not sewn. Even they have kalayim. Now kalayim b'chal may not be used. So here we got a problem. What type of material kalayim may you send on Yamtiv? Stam to send something that the recipient may not use, whether it's a Yamtiv limitation or it's a general limitation, should both be prohibited. So the Gemara is going to explain. However, only if you can use it on Yamtiv. Avol, but what may you not send? Loisander hamesumar, not the sandal with spikes. We're going to review the story, the tragic story that happened with the sandal hamesumar. We're going to speak about it the next year, God willing, tomorrow. But that may not be worn. Can't send that. Or an unsewn shoe, because there's no way that you can use it on Yamtiv. Because you need to have a professional to sew it. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, afloy min alaven, white shoes may also not be sent. So this is before the whole golfing culture, or I don't know, some shoes, Yom Kippur culture. Everyone goes with white shoes. In those days, there wasn't a mitzias of white shoes. It means to wear shoes, it had to be black, and you would therefore have to dye, paint, color your shoes. Now, if you can color it in an unusual way, that would be less problematic. But since getting your untied shoes, unsewn shoes, or your white shoes, to make them wearable, it needs a uman, it needs a craftsman, it needs a professional to blacken it, and that may not be done on Yamtiv, so therefore you cannot send the raw materials. And zehaklal, simple. Kol shenei oisin boy b'yamtiv. Any item that the recipient can have hana'ah, can have benefit, can make use of kosher on Yamtiv, that you may send. But an article, it's very nice that you're sending a gift, but if there's nothing the recipient can use the gift for on Yamtiv, then you may not send it on Yamtiv as well. Very good. Says the Gemara like this. Okay, let's analyze every case in the Mishnah. Bishleim etfurim, when we're speaking about material, kalim, garments, if they're sewn, a machaya, a shirt, you can wear it. Chazal amalbush. She'ein etfurim, even when you're sending a non-sewn garment, but it's good material. Chazi nami chazali kisuye, you can cover yourself with it. You have a piece of material. Elaklayim, but if there's a material that's made out of a mixture of wool and linen called klayim, l'may chazu, what benefit can you have from it? And v'chitema chazu l'mein machtu, you can fold this garment and you can sit on it. You're not wearing it, you're only, you're patting the hard wooden bench. You're not allowed to do that. V'hatanya, based on the psukim we have in Parshas Kedoshim, when it says lo yalu olecha, don't put it on you. So Chazal infer, on you, you may not. But what does Hashem mean to say? By biblical law, you can fold it and place it underneath you. You can sit on it. That's midoraisa. But midrabanan you may not. And why may you not sit on kalayim? Because maybe a thread will become loose, and that thread is going to wrap itself around, a part of your body, and it's going to add some warmth. So since rabbinically you can't even sit on kalayim, why should you be allowed to send it? And v'chi tema, that when did Chazal prohibit sitting on kalayim? Only if you are directly sitting on kalayim. But if you have a couple of things that intervene, you and the kalayim, you can add it as extra padding. V'chi tema the mafsik midi beini ubeini, that there's something in between you and the kalayim. So even if some thread is going to get loose, In this case, it's not going to wrap around you. Oichet not allowed midrabanan. Amar Rab Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rabbi Yishua ben Levi, Amar Rabbi Yossi ben Shol, Amar Rebbe, Mishum Kahala Kadisha de Yerushalayim. That what afilu eser matzoi zu al gabe zu. Even if you have 10 mattresses, 10 paddings, one on top of the other, we always have to hak Yerushalayim and we give cover to the Yerushalmis. V'kalayim tachteim aser lishan aleim. You can't sleep on it. So it's not allowed midrabanan. And we're not goyres. We're not goyres the pasuk because we just said it's a midrabanan. So answers the Gemara, Ella, the only, why could you send a garment, a shmata, material, not a garment, a material, even though it has kalayim, is biviloin. Curtains, beautiful. Curtains are allowed to be made out of shatnez because curtains are not called a beged. Perfect. So it could be used as a curtain. Not so simple. V'ha'amar ula. When it comes to the laws of purity and impurity, what is susceptible to becoming impure? Adam, kalim, oichlin, and mashkin, and nothing else. And when we speak about kalim, it excludes real estate, a home. I know there's an exception of tzoras habayis, that's the exception. Something that's connected to the ground cannot become tummy. A viloin, a curtain, is hung on the house. It should be viewed as part of the home. So mepneima amru viloin is tummy. Why don't we consider it house? And on that Ula explained, because even though you hang it and it's mechuber, and for other halachas you would say something connected to land, including to a house, has the halachic status of real estate, which can never become tamei. But because someone, a shamish, if he's cold and he needs something to warm himself, he's going to go on the curtain. We see kids do it the whole time. So a curtain that could become tamei should also not be allowed to be made out of shatnez. That's the kasha, daf tezvav. Let's get a few lines in. Answers the Gemara. Why? What type of material that's made out of a mixture of wool and linen is allowed to be sent on Yamtiv? Which material could be used not on Yamtiv? Ella bekoshin. Bekoshin zok Rashi. Any beged that's very hard. Now what the line is, I don't know. But the problem of shatnez is beged, a garment, or even if you're not using it as a beged, but if it adds warmth to your body, that's included in beged. If it's very hard, so first of all, there's not going to be a nima, there's not going to be a thread. The whole thing is hard. Warmth it won't add. That's allowed to be used. What will be an example? Hai namta. Namta's felt. Gamda, hard, a hard felt. The types of hard felts that were used typically in the city of Neirosh, Sharia, you are allowed. Again, we're not speaking about making a garment. No one made garments. It was very hard. But sitting on that without even anything intervening is going to be permissible. There's no threads. It's not a thready garment. It was hardened. It's made into a felt. Not there's a problem of a nima. Not it's going to add any warmth. There isn't even an isin midrabanan. And only that is what the Mishnah is referring to. Another example, Amar of Papa, Ardolayin, undershoes. I think what we call a sole. In other words, even though in your shoe, that which is closest to your foot, that's already geschmack. They make it, padded. They can add warmth. Sometimes you schwitz. But underneath, that which is meant to be go on the floor, that which is meant that even if you step on a stone or a pebble, you should not feel it. And today we have other materials, but if they had a mixture of wool and linen, but it was that hard that it serves as an ardolayim, again it's hard. Amarava, hani sorare de pshite, coin bags. Many bags in which you kept coins were made out of shatnez. Now people don't sit on them, but many times you put it on your lap. You want to count the coins. That is, right? So they're very hard. Again, they were very hard bags. And since they are hard, they don't add warmth. And therefore, even on a rabbinic level, ein bahem mishum kalaim, there's no problem. Even if they're made out of kalaim, yes, you can put it on your lap. However, the bizrane, bags that were used to hold seeds, they were not as hard. And therefore, there's a problem of kalayim, so make sure that you don't make them out of wool and linen together. Rav Ashi Amar, echad zeh ve'echad zeh ein behem mishum kalayim. Because it's not about, does it give you warmth, but lefi she'ein derech chimum bekach. People don't use a bag, a storage bag, on their lap to warm themselves. A curtain they do, a bag they don't, so he allows for you to have even the bags that are used to store bizrane, these seeds, are allowed to be made out of shatnez. Chevra will stop over here, and then tomorrow, God willing, we're going to already finish the first Perek and go into the second chapter of Beitzah.